February 20, 1942. Changi, a strip of reclaimed swamp and battered barracks on the eastern shore of Singapore. The sun had already climbed, baking the corrugated roofs and sending heat waves off the packed earth. The air smelled of diesel, wet canvas, and something metallic, the residue of battle and the lingering scent of antiseptic from field hospitals that had been abandoned in the confusion of the surrender. It began before dawn for most of them, not with alarms, but with a rustling like a procession of trapped insects. Masako Ishikawa woke to the muffled orders of soldiers somewhere beyond the thin wall of the wooden NCO hut where she slept. She was 24, a reserve nurse whose hands had learned the language of splints and morphine, a woman who had once traced the faces of wounded sailors with a practiced tenderness. Nearby, Haru Tanemura, 31 and steady-eyed, tied a bandana over hair that had been singed at the tips by the same conflagration that took their city. Keiko Sato, barely 19, clutched a scrap of a letter from home and smelled the paper like a talisman against the day. They were not military prisoners in the sense of captured frontline soldiers, they were hospital staff, kitchen workers, and a scattering of civilian women, all rounded up in the chaotic days after the British command lowered the white flag. The British and Commonwealth forces, exhausted and desperate, had assumed responsibility for prisoners found in the rubble, soldiers of the Imperial Japanese Army who had been left wounded or separated, and mixed in among them, these women who served in uniform or in civilian clothes in the shattered wards and supply depots. By first light, a column of guards, some British, some Australian, some from the Indian and Malayan regiments that still wore patched uniforms and the look of men who had been on the march for weeks, arrived with a new set of orders. Sergeant Thomas Reed carried himself with a rigid, clinical calm. Years at the front had given his face a map of lines and a narrowness around the mouth that made sympathy difficult. Beside him, Corporal Ahmed Khan, a young man from the Punjab with eyes that flicked constantly, measuring distance and danger, held a roll of paper and a penciled list. Their weapons were slung but never out of reach, Lee Enfield rifles, bayonets sheathed, a cord of leather and steel that suggested both protection and threat. Security inspection, Reed announced in clipped English that the Japanese women could not adequately parse. A translator, Private James Fletcher, who had spent a few months in Singapore before the collapse, repeated the order in handsomely phrased Japanese, the syllables coming out like formal knocks at a door that would not open. They were to line up in single file outside the makeshift compound. It was a routine, the kind of administrative choreography armies perform to feel in control when everything else is unmoored. The compound was a cleared rectangle of dirt, cordoned by barbed wire and 3 rows of sandbags. There were stretchers stacked like a small town's worth of ghosts and a couple of improvised latrines. The women moved like sleepwalkers into their places, the memory of the surrender still a raw seam in their minds. Around them, Allied soldiers readied clipboards. A canvas tent flapped behind them, its flap tied open. Beyond it, a line of transport trucks waited, engines idling. What followed began with the banalities of war: roll call, the checking of identities, the counting of hands and feet. The guards took names and compared them to their lists. It was during the 4th roll call that the directive shifted from administrative to intimate, not in the way of care, but in the way of control. "Remove your outer garments," Reed ordered. The translator's voice trembled, trying to hold its neutrality. The women glanced at each other, the motion of shoulders like birds startled into flight. In the humid morning, fabric clung to skin. For lice. For screening. For sanitary inspection, Fletcher added, as if to put a clinical seal on a demand that felt anything but. In that moment faces froze, not simply from fear, but with a mounting shame that was cultural and private. For these women, the act of undressing in public was not a procedure but a violation of everything they had been taught to hide. Masako's hands moved automatically to the waistband of her uniform skirt, Haru's jaw tightened. Keiko's breath sped. They were taught to obey, to accept orders with the tight-lipped discipline drilled into them in hospitals and schools, yet there was a new equation in the air: obedience measured against dignity. The British guards explained, in measured phrases, that the inspection was meant to look for disease, for lice, for contraband hidden within clothing. They demonstrated the action by handing garments to a matronly nurse in a khaki smock who turned garments inside out and shook them methodically. Yet the spectacle of women stripping, even a layer at a time, drew attention from every man present. Eyes, even when averted, counted. Masako lowered her hands. Her fingers trembled. When she reached for the buttons it was like opening a seam in her life, the cloth whispered against her skin. She felt the gaze of Corporal Khan pass over her like a draft. He kept his face stern, his eyes were trained soldiers' eyes, scanning for threats, not dwelling on individuals. But the human mind does what the human mind does under stress, it notices. The guards, too, were complicit in the theater of power. To command someone to disrobe in public is to assert dominion, to reduce a person to vulnerability under the guise of procedure. The inspection escalated slowly. Women were asked to remove stockings, to roll up sleeves, to turn pockets inside out. Then a guard, more blunt than the rest, gestured toward the lower half of the body. "Remove your pants," he said. There are words that do not translate cleanly, and there are commands that leap across languages with the force of a dropped stone. The order landed like an impact. A hush took the compound like a tide. For some of the women, the phrase meant first and foremost medical necessity, for others, it was an affront to modesty. They understood, in an instant, that the men before them were no longer treating them as comrades or as neutral civilians, they were treating them as objects of inspection. The first woman to obey did so because obedience had become a reflex. She stepped forward, hands smoothing the fabric before unfastening. Her movements were mechanical, practiced, like the motions of a nurse about to attend to a wound. But the rest watched her with the rawness of spectators at a crucifixion. The mats and stretchers behind them made small shadows. Sweat gathered at the napes of necks, the light on metal glared. Haru's hands stayed clenched at her sides. She had been a head nurse before the surrender, used to giving orders and seeing them obeyed. The command to remove her trousers felt like a reversal of the universe, authority taken from her and given to strangers. Masako remembered her mother's voice from years prior, the admonition to preserve decorum even under strain. Those lessons now collided with the immediate, practical fear that compliance would make a small mercy of their situation. Refusal, they all understood, could invite worse scrutiny. Reed watched the way they moved. He had been stationed in Malaya for months, his body hardened by the logic of chain of command. He told himself that he was carrying out a routine, lice inspections, prevention of epidemics in crowded compounds, simple logistics. Yet as he observed the women, as names met faces and lives met lists, something else crept in, too, the awareness that orders that pry into a body are different from orders that lift a crate. The power to demand undressing is a kind of authority that leaves a residue, and he felt, in the quiet between commands, the weight of that residue. The younger soldiers were less certain of their role. Private Alan Pike, barely 20, shifted his rifle from one shoulder to the other and tried to keep his eyes averted. He had grown up in Leeds, and understood the abstract concept of propriety. He also understood that the men in his unit were young, scarred, and carrying their own anxieties about what the surrender meant for them. Some of them laughed quietly, an edge of relief in their voices, others stood motionless. The inspection moved on. The women removed garments one by one, skirting, stockings, the stiff underpinnings that had been standard issue for uniforms and private lives alike. At no point did any of the guards physically touch them. There were rules, even in the makeshift justice of a prison compound. But the line between procedure and humiliation is not always measured by hands on skin. It is measured by the context that gives a formal order its sting. A translator repeated the reason for the search: lice, disease, possible contraband. Fletcher's voice lacked the tone of malice, he read the words of the authority that had been given him. Still, there was a practical question: where would the women go if lice were found? Would they be isolated? Would they be placed in quarantine? The logistics were murky, and answers were thin. One woman, a matron named Fumiko Nakahara who had served quietly as a supply clerk, suddenly clutched at her abdomen and began to cry. Her sobs were small and raw, and the sound seemed to ricochet off the sandbags. The act of removal had unlocked something else, grief that had been packed away during retreats and surrenders. Haru moved to her side, offering a hand with the mechanical kindness of someone who had spent long hours in funeral wards and operating rooms, providing what comfort was possible within reach. Word spread among the guards that a young Japanese lieutenant, shot and surrendering earlier in the week, had been found in a nearby shed. The news made the atmosphere taut. Guard rotations quickened, rifles were adjusted. The inspection of women, once clinical, took on a new slant. Nervousness threaded the men's movements, a fear that contraband could include anything from hidden weapons to coded messages sewn into hems. To control bodies is to control stories. To force a woman to undress in front of strangers is also to assert the right to read her as text, to scan pockets, to feel for seams and folds and the hiding places of the small rebellions that war breeds, love letters, foreign coins, the names of sons. For Japanese women who had been trained in silence and service, the wrenching of those secrets into the open was a secondary humiliation. As the inspection wound toward its close, a figure moved through the line whose presence altered the tenor of the morning, Captain William Harrow, commanding officer of the ad hoc detention camp. He was a man whose uniform still had the neatness of pre-surrender discipline, medals had been stripped yet his bearing retained the memory of rank. Harrow watched the women not as a man inspecting goods but as one who had to answer to higher authorities. He moved with the deliberation of someone who understood optics, how a photo of the scene, or a report to Wellington or London, could be interpreted in a dozen ways. He addressed the group, his voice carrying across the compound, "This is strictly sanitary and procedural. I will not tolerate impropriety. Any complaints will be reported." His words were intended to reassure and to distance. He offered a thin apology for the discomfort, an apology that acknowledged procedure but did not account for the shame. When the last woman smoothed her skirt back down and pulled her stockings into place, the compound did not return to its prior indifference. A hush lingered, a quiet like the one after a blow is received. The women walked away in a line, faces set like coins. The guards continued their notes, checked their lists, and shuffled toward the waiting trucks. But in the pockets of those skirts, in the folds of the cotton, there were new separations, the knowledge that they had been seen in ways they had not consented to, the awareness that the body could be used as a battlefield for dignity. That afternoon, as the sun slid low and shadows lengthened across the compound, whispers began to spread, not only from the women who had been inspected, but from the men who had watched. Rumors gather, and they change as they move. Some claimed the inspection had been warranted, others said it had been an excuse for prurient curiosity. For the captives, the memory settled into the small private places where fear and shame stand side by side. In the dim light, Masako sat on an overturned crate, fingers pressed to the spot where her uniform had been tugged. She thought of home, of a small house in Yokohama where her father kept a box of pressed flowers. She tried to count the petals in her memory to steady herself, but the image of the morning kept returning, the breeze that had slipped across her skin as she obeyed a command, the sound of boots on packed earth, the hurried scribble of a clerk's pencil. Those details stitched themselves into the raw tapestry of capture, evidence, perhaps, more durable than the paper on which the guard had written her name. Outside the barbed wire, the city of Singapore was a place of ash and smoke, of scattered fires and empty storefronts. Inside, the makeshift prison wore its own scars. It was here, in this microcosm of war's afterlife, that the small decisions of men and women would echo, how orders are given, how dignity is negotiated, and how the body becomes a prize for the victor and a battlefield for the vanquished. They had survived the fall of a fortress, they had survived the march into captivity. But an inspection that asked them to undress had left a fissure that was not easily mended. In the nights that followed, these women would share stories in whispers, of small kindnesses and cruelties, of the odd soldier who brought extra rations, and of the bright, cold memory of being asked to remove the last layer of armor they possessed, their privacy. Night fell early over Changi that February. The sun, dulled by smoke and sea haze, slipped behind the horizon with a tired, amber glow. Inside the camp, the air thickened with humidity and the faint smell of boiled rice. Mosquitoes whined in low, rhythmic patterns, and somewhere in the distance, a radio crackled, the British camp command reporting to higher headquarters, logging another day of uneasy order among the prisoners. For the Japanese women confined behind the wire, the day's ordeal did not end with the inspection. It lingered in their posture, in the way they folded their hands or avoided each other's eyes. Silence became their armor. No one spoke of the moment aloud, to name it would be to relive it. Instead, they busied themselves with small acts of preservation, washing bandages, cleaning the corners of their hut, whispering prayers under their breath. In the dim glow of kerosene lamps, each movement was deliberate, mechanical, a ritual against despair. Masako Ishikawa sat near the back of the barracks, her nurse's satchel open on her knees. The supplies were meager, a few rolls of gauze, some iodine, 2 pairs of scissors dulled from overuse. She counted them anyway, as though taking inventory of her own control. Across from her, Haru Tanemura patched the tear in another woman's uniform skirt with black thread pulled from her own. The rhythm of needle and cloth was the only steady sound in the room. Outside, the guards smoked by the perimeter. Some laughed softly, trading stories from before the war, the kind of half-remembered normalcy men reach for when they have seen too much. Others kept their eyes fixed on the horizon, pretending not to hear the whispers that drifted from inside the huts. Whatever justification they had been told for the inspection, it had left a mark on them as well. In war, orders were followed, what they meant came later. Over the next days, the women tried to rebuild a semblance of routine. They established shifts for cleaning and cooking, tending to the few wounded who had been captured alongside them. They organized scraps of paper into makeshift diaries, careful to hide them beneath bedding or in the hollow of a wall plank. They rationed water by spoonfuls and divided rice into equal piles with quiet precision. The discipline that had once been their pride as nurses now became their means of endurance. Then came the fever outbreak. By late February, a wave of dysentery and malaria began to sweep through the lower compound, a consequence of overcrowding, heat, and contaminated water. The Allied guards were stretched thin, their own ranks were sick, supplies short, tempers shorter. It was here that the Japanese women began to find a fragile kind of purpose. Despite being captives, their medical training made them indispensable. When one of the guards collapsed during a night patrol, it was Masako who ran to his side, checking his pulse and pressing a damp cloth to his forehead. The gesture startled him, this sudden reversal of roles, where the prisoner became the caregiver. Word of her actions reached Captain Harrow the next morning. He ordered the women to assist the overworked camp medics. It was a pragmatic decision, not an act of compassion, yet it changed the atmosphere. For the first time, the women were allowed to move outside the wire during daylight under supervision. They scrubbed infirmary floors, dressed wounds, and mixed crude disinfectants from what little alcohol and carbolic they could find. Their hands moved with the calm efficiency of professionals who had spent years saving lives, even as their own were circumscribed by captivity. Slowly, respect began to replace suspicion. Sergeant Reed, who had delivered the orders days before, found himself pausing whenever he passed the medical tent. The sight of the women working, sleeves rolled, faces composed, unsettled him in ways he could not articulate. The memory of the inspection replayed in his mind, its cold practicality now tinged with guilt. He told himself it was regulation, that in war there was no room for sentiment. But the human conscience is stubborn, it remembers. The women, for their part, spoke little to the guards. But within their own ranks, a quiet camaraderie took root. At night they whispered stories of home, of cherry blossoms on school grounds, of tea shared with fathers before the call to service, of streets now surely destroyed by bombing. In those stories, they found pieces of themselves that captivity could not take. By March, the fever had claimed dozens of prisoners, both Allied and Japanese. Yet the cooperation between captives and captors had brought a fragile order back to the camp. Disease, oddly enough, had become the great equalizer. Everyone was vulnerable, everyone depended on the care of another. One evening, as the sky turned the color of iron, Captain Harrow walked through the camp's medical ward. He stopped beside Masako, who was tending to a feverish Indian soldier. She acknowledged him with a slight bow but no words. Harrow hesitated, then said quietly, "You've saved more of my men than some of my own doctors." It was not praise so much as a statement of record. She nodded once and went back to her work. When he turned to leave, Harrow paused again. His voice softened. "The inspection, it shouldn't have been handled that way. I'll see that it never happens again." Masako did not look up. The silence that followed was not forgiveness, merely the quiet recognition that words, however sincere, could not erase what had been done. That night, the camp was still. Rain began to fall in heavy, rhythmic sheets, drumming on the tin roofs and washing dust into muddy rivulets. Inside the huts, the women lay awake listening to it. The rain drowned out memories, if only for a few hours. And when morning came, they rose again, to count rations, tend to the sick, and live another day within the narrow boundaries of war. Their dignity, though battered, remained intact. In their silence and labor, they reclaimed a small, unspoken victory, survival with their humanity still their own. By April 1942, the rains had become relentless. The monsoon season swept across the Malay Peninsula, turning the campgrounds into a soup of red clay and stagnant puddles. Each morning began with the same ritual: the rattle of tin mess cups, the sharp bark of roll call, and the muffled sound of coughing from the infirmary tents. Yet beneath this monotony, the camp was changing. The lines between captor and captive, so rigid in the early weeks, had begun to blur in the slow grind of shared hardship. Masako, Haru, and the others now worked daily alongside Allied medics. The nurses improvised with what they had, cutting bandages from discarded shirts, sterilizing instruments over kerosene flames, and writing medical logs in a mix of Japanese and English on scavenged paper. The tension of the first inspection still haunted them, but work gave them something else to hold on to: purpose. Haru often spoke softly while she worked, murmuring in Japanese the words of old clinic routines: right arm, left arm, pulse steady. The men around her couldn't understand the language, but they recognized the tone: calm, professional, reassuring. Her voice cut through the feverish delirium of the sick, carrying with it a discipline that transcended allegiance. Even so, mistrust lingered like the humidity. There were still guards who saw the Japanese women not as fellow humans but as symbols of the enemy who had humiliated their comrades at the surrender. Occasionally, whispers flared, accusations that the women were spies, that their work in the infirmary was cover for collecting intelligence. Each rumor brought another inspection, another round of questions. Captain Harrow tried to temper the paranoia. "They're nurses," he told his officers, "not soldiers. They serve the same God of mercy you do." But war corrodes empathy, and words of reason often drowned beneath the weight of vengeance and fatigue. One afternoon, the quiet order of the camp fractured again. A British corporal, young, exhausted, his nerves frayed by weeks of fever duty, accused one of the women, Keiko Sato, of stealing morphine from the infirmary stock. The confrontation took place in front of the barracks, in the full glare of the sun. Keiko, trembling but defiant, denied the charge. Her Japanese was broken with fear, but the emotion was unmistakable. Sergeant Reed intervened before the argument became violent. He ordered an immediate search, not of the women's bodies this time, but of their sleeping quarters. Harrow stood by, his expression tight. The scene drew the attention of the entire camp. As boxes and blankets were overturned, something fell from Keiko's small bundle of possessions, a piece of folded paper. It was not morphine, it was a page torn from an English-language medical textbook, annotated in Japanese. She had been studying, trying to learn the medicine used by the Allied doctors. Reed froze. The young corporal's face turned crimson with shame. Harrow picked up the paper, examined it, and quietly folded it back. "You're dismissed," he said to the corporal, his voice low but sharp. That night, Keiko sat apart from the others, her back to the wall. She didn't cry. Masako placed a hand on her shoulder but said nothing. The silence between them was thick with understanding, a bond born not from shared nationality alone, but from endurance. The next morning, Captain Harrow addressed the entire camp. He spoke briefly, but his message carried weight: there will be no more accusations without evidence. These women are under my protection. It was an unusual statement in that place and time, a small act of authority used to draw a moral line. Over the following weeks, small gestures began to bridge the gulf between the sides. A medic slipped extra quinine tablets into the women's stores. A guard quietly returned a set of sewing needles confiscated earlier. Haru taught one of the British nurses how to fold bandages in the Japanese triangular method, more efficient than the standard roll. Each gesture was unspoken diplomacy, not of nations, but of individuals navigating the gray zones of war. By May, letters began to arrive, the first since their capture. The Red Cross had finally reached the camp, and with it came a thin trickle of supplies and censored messages from families. The women took turns reading their letters aloud, their voices trembling with both joy and grief. Some messages were hopeful, others were short and final, notices of loved ones lost in bombings back home. For Masako, the letter carried only a single line from her mother: "Live as though you still carry your father's name with honor." It was both blessing and burden. She folded the paper carefully and placed it in her satchel, beside her medical tools. The Red Cross visit also meant new scrutiny. Allied officials toured the camp, inspecting facilities, taking notes. Captain Harrow guided them through the wards with a measured calm. He spoke of shortages, of disease control, of discipline maintained under difficult conditions. When they asked about the female prisoners, he paused before answering. "They've been through more than most," he said simply. That evening, as the camp quieted under the call of night insects, the women gathered by the fence line. Beyond it, they could see the faint outline of the sea, the same sea that separated them from home. The world beyond was still burning, the war far from over. But for that brief moment, the boundary between captor and captive blurred once more. Masako watched the horizon and thought of the strange truth she had come to understand: that survival in captivity was not just about enduring hunger or sickness, but about preserving the small, invisible parts of oneself that refused to yield: dignity, memory, and the capacity for compassion, even toward one's jailers. The war would continue to grind on. New prisoners would arrive. Old ones would disappear into the lists of the dead. But within the muddy fences of Changi, amid the sickness and the silence, a fragile humanity persisted, unrecorded, unseen, yet unbroken. June 1942. The rains had passed, leaving the camp caked in a thick layer of cracked mud that hardened beneath the sun. The monsoon humidity was gone, replaced by dry heat that burned the skin and split lips. Every breath tasted of salt and rust. Yet the camp at Changi moved with a strange, quiet rhythm, one that came from routine born of necessity. The women had been prisoners for nearly 4 months. Time had become elastic, stretching and folding in on itself. Days blurred into each other, marked only by the arrival of rations, the changing of guards, and the daily lists that Captain Harrow insisted be read aloud in both English and Japanese. Masako had begun keeping a secret journal, not of names or events that could endanger anyone, but of details too small to be noticed by the men who commanded them. The way the light cut through the wire fence in the morning, the sound of a British bugle echoing off the tin roofs, the tiny green shoots that appeared in the cracks of the latrine walls. "If I stop seeing the small things," she wrote one night, "then I stop being human." It was in late June that the first whispers of possible repatriation reached the compound. Allied command, overwhelmed by the number of prisoners taken after Singapore's fall, had begun negotiations for limited exchanges, wounded for wounded, medical staff for medical staff. The rumor spread like wine through dry grass, feeding both hope and fear. For the Japanese women, repatriation meant the chance to return home. But it also meant returning to a nation that believed capture was the ultimate disgrace. In Japanese military culture, surrender was often equated with shame. For women who had served in auxiliary or nursing units, captivity could brand them as dishonored. The thought of home, once a source of comfort, now carried the weight of uncertainty. Haru, who had been the most steadfast among them, voiced what the others were too afraid to say. "If we go back," she whispered, "will they even want us?" The question lingered. No one answered. Meanwhile, Captain Harrow and his men faced their own struggles. The camp was under constant audit, shortages of food, the threat of disease, and now, inspections from newly arrived officers who questioned his leniency toward the Japanese nurses. One morning, an Australian major accused Harrow of coddling the enemy. The argument was brief but sharp. Harrow, his patience long frayed, simply replied, "Mercy isn't a weakness. It's the only thing keeping us from becoming what we hate." The tension within the Allied ranks mirrored the uncertainty among the captives. As weeks passed, supplies grew scarcer. The Red Cross deliveries slowed. A black market thrived in secret, cigarettes traded for food, soap for medicine, loyalty for survival. The women, however, refused to take part. "We are nurses," Masako told the others. "Not merchants of despair." One evening in early July, the air trembled with the low hum of distant aircraft. Allied bombers, perhaps American, had begun to strike Japanese supply lines across the region. The prisoners ran to the edge of the fence to glimpse the faint silhouettes overhead. For the first time, the war felt close again. Some of the guards watched in silence, their faces lit faintly by the flickering horizon. That night, the women could hear Harrow's voice from his office, reading dispatches by lamplight. "The tide is turning," he murmured to Reed. "But it'll take years before any of us see home again." Inside the barracks, Masako sat awake beside Keiko and Haru. The faint glow of the moon spilled through the slats, catching on the edge of her satchel. She opened her mother's letter and read it again. The ink had smudged from sweat, but the words still held power, live with honor. She wondered what honor meant now, whether it was obedience, or defiance, or simply endurance. She had seen kindness from enemies, cruelty from allies, and courage in places where dignity had been stripped bare. The war, she thought, had rewritten all definitions. Weeks later, in mid-August, a list was posted outside the command hut. Repatriation had been approved, but only for the severely wounded. None of the women were on it. Their disappointment was quiet, almost dignified in its inevitability. Masako folded her satchel shut, resolved not to let the waiting consume her. In the months that followed, the war beyond Changi continued its brutal course. Reports trickled in, the Philippines had fallen, Burma was burning, and the Pacific was now a chessboard of retreat and counterattack. Inside the camp, however, time froze. For both prisoners and guards, survival had become its own kind of truce. By early 1945, the rumble of distant artillery announced what everyone had dared not hope: the war's end was approaching. Allied bombers passed overhead more frequently now, their silver bodies flashing in sunlight. The guards had grown restless, orders from higher command came less frequently. The power dynamic within the camp shifted almost overnight. On a humid morning in August 1945, word finally came: Japan had surrendered. The women gathered silently as the announcement was read aloud by Captain Harrow, his voice steady but grave. "Hostilities are over," he said. "You are free." The words hung in the air, disbelieved. Freedom, after years of captivity, felt unreal, almost frightening. Some of the women wept quietly. Others simply stood still, as if waiting for another order to follow. Masako felt her knees weaken. Haru took her hand. Keiko pressed her face into her sleeve and sobbed. The war that had taken everything, comrades, pride, certainty, had finally ended. In the days that followed, Allied transport ships began to arrive to take the prisoners home. Before their departure, Captain Harrow assembled them one last time. "I cannot undo what has happened here," he said. "But I hope history remembers that even in war, we found ways not to lose our humanity." Masako looked at him, this man who had been both jailer and reluctant protector, and bowed. "History forgets," she replied softly, "but people remember." When she finally stepped aboard the ship bound for Japan, she turned once more toward the camp, its fences silhouetted against the burning sky. Somewhere within those wires lay years of pain and small acts of kindness that no official report would ever record. She whispered a quiet farewell, not just to the camp, but to the person she had been when she first arrived. The ship's horn sounded, long and mournful, as the shoreline began to fade into mist. The sea ahead was vast and uncertain, but it was freedom.